Huh?
Okay.
Yes.
Did you get your hat?
No.
I heard that we had a halftime show last week.
Oh, that's true.
Oh my gosh.
I cracked up actually when I saw it.
I was just trying to get a synthesis.
Is that what it was?
Yeah. About light.
To say everything that you said last week.
No, I didn't record everything.
You did?
They were probably expecting payouts and they got you.
You tell me. No, don't worry about it. So why do I know you all the time?
No, it's all about you.
It's cold.
We're all boxed in here.
It's bad. Bad. Cold.
You can have that a little bit more.
Trying to believe you're just in here for Canada.
What?
Trying to believe you're just in here for Canada finals.
We were this morning. I
All right. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Our Father,
Who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. First of all, I would just like to remind us all that we're just not the only ones here, that this is also live streaming. So there are people out there. And long ago I should have invited, if you are out there, I should have invited you to email in any questions or any concerns or anything like that you have, because certainly that would contribute also to what we discuss here. So you're welcome to do that. And while we're talking about the those who are watching the live stream, those who are watching online, Father Fernandez got a free book in the mail from a publishing company, and with it, it is the commentaries on the 4 Book of Sentences, Bonaventure's. This is the translation of Bonaventure's commentaries on the sentences, Book 1, on the one in the Triune God. So there it is. So I told Sean that I'll read this to you this evening. But it is kind of a breakthrough, because Bonaventure's commentaries have not been translated. Many of Thomas's commentaries have also not been translated. So this is kind of a breakthrough, and it is, interestingly enough, the book itself is $80, which surprised me, because I thought it would be considerably more than that, just by the pound. It should be. And so I think he said it was $300 for 5, which, if you can do division, you know that's less than $80 a piece. So if anybody wants this, let me know. I certainly am going to get one. He's going to hang on to this one for bedtime reading. But yeah, so if anybody wants one, but I've looked through it, and it's I mean, it's really, the print's good, the paper's good. We trust the translation is also good. And it really is a kind of a root and a source of all medieval theology. Peter Lombard's sentences and the commentaries on those sentences. It was necessary to write a commentary on the sentences to get their magister degree at the University of Paris. That was kind of the exercise. And it was a considerable exercise, as you can see, because this is book 1. But the others will be coming out. So if anybody wants that, if anybody is interested in that, let me know. And like I said, I'll get one. And if anybody else wants them, I can order them for you. Okay? And if you don't know them, it's understandable. All right, as we start out this evening, are there any questions or any discussions or anything that have come up about any of this? So it's all perfectly clear. And the people on live stream are muted. So the challenges won't be there from them. Although, again, you're welcome to do it by email. We left off last time talking about the principle, the communicative principle of the second person of the Blessed Trinity. We saw, in a way, how that kind of moves into an understanding also of liturgy. And we can come back to that in time. But what we're going to look at now, first of all, is to try and contextualize the overall vision of Bonaventure and the obstacles to it. This was a great controversy back when I was in the seminary in St. Charles in Columbus. There was a section of our library where all the books had green dots on them. And those were the ones you were not allowed to read. In there was a very popular book at the time. You could take the book out and read it if you got the rector's permission. And there was a book in there by kind of a very famous and popular theological writer at the time, Thierry de Chardin. I don't know if you know of Chardin. Okay. And the book was the Divine Milieu, Le Milieu divin, and it had a green dot on it. And so I asked the rector if I could read it, and he said, of course. So I read it. And it is kind of a marvelous vision. Thierry de Chardin was a Jesuit paleontologist. So he dug up bones and things like that. He was involved in the whole thing of the Peking man. And I don't know whether you've ever read about that or know about that. It was thought to be one of the oldest human remains found, and it turned out to be a hoax, didn't it? A hoax, or at least it wasn't what they said it was, whatever it was. But he wrote a book called The Phenomenon of Man, and he also wrote this Divine Milieu. It was very, very popular. And it helped to kind of create kind of this cosmic positive vision, the harmony of the universe and all things. It was the total acceptance of kind of an inevitable evolutionary movement from the created order back into and very much like Irenaeus of Lyon. If you had Irenaeus of Lyon, the recapitulation in Christ, the anakephalaiosis in Christo, okay? That everything, again, it is this exitus et radius. It's this return into the Christ of the whole created order. But Chardin was very popular, and my guess would be that probably everybody was reading it who was in the seminary or interested at all in theological studies and stuff at that time. But there was a critique of it. And the critique of it came primarily from the Dominicans. And the critique of it it ignored the whole phenomenon of original sin. And so this whole sweeping vision, somehow or other, had left a whole piece out of history, so to speak. Father Piet Schonenberg, a Dutch Jesuit, taught at the University of Nijmegen, wrote kind of a corrective of, Schonenberg was a controversial theologian, but he wrote kind of a corrective to Chardin's Divine Milieu. And I think it was called God's World in the Making. But he interjected into that the element of history, that into evolution, into this sweeping vision of Chardin, Schonenberg introduced the concept of history as being a disruptive force in the evolutionary move back toward back toward the recapitulation of all things in Christ. And I can't even remember what Chardin called that now. I had it in my mind a while ago, and I don't remember. But it certainly was, he saw it all, the universe as a great harmonious reality. He envisioned it in a musical term, and of all the different notes and pieces and instruments and all, create this celestial harmony of God's creation. The idea of not introducing the issue of sin, which Schonenberg chose to introduce because he had an idiosyncratic understanding, a Chardinian understanding, actually, I suppose, of original sin, which was not really accepted. And but he tried then to redeem Chardin's work and make it more theologically acceptable. But it kind of came after the horse was out of the barn, and in so doing that, it didn't have a big impact. And so, as the criticisms of Chardin began to mount, probably in the 70s and maybe even the 80s, he kind of disappeared back into the background and was no longer really a significant character in any of the modern way of thinking of things. It's interesting, though, the book itself is an interesting book for someone who struggles with belief in God at all, because it is kind of a compelling vision. And you can wait for original sin sometimes to become part of the discourse. So it still, I think, is useful to that. But both Francis and Bonaventure were very, very much aware. So when we talk of these sweeping visions of the harmonious universe and this inevitability of the raditus in Christ and all of this kind of thing, there is then Francis you've ever read any of the itinerarium. Okay, and in the prologue, such desires are enkindled in us in two ways: by an outcry of prayer that makes us call aloud in the groaning of our heart, and by the flash of insight by which the mind turns most directly and intently toward the rays of light. First, therefore, I invite the reader to the groans of prayer through Christ crucified, through whose blood we are cleansed from the filth of vice, so that he not believe that reading is sufficient without unction, speculation without devotion, investigation without wonder, observation without joy, work without piety, knowledge without love, understanding without humility, endeavor without divine grace. Reflection is a mirror without divinely inspired wisdom. To those, therefore, predisposed by divine grace, the humble and the pious, the contrite and the devout, those anointed with the oil of gladness, the lovers of divine wisdom, and those inflamed with the desire for those wishing to give themselves to glorifying wonder at and even savoring God, I propose the following considerations, suggesting that the mirror presented by the external world is of little or no value, unless the mirror of our soul has been cleansed and polished. Therefore, man of God, first exercise yourself the remorse of conscience before you raise your eyes to the rays of wisdom reflected in its mirrors, lest perhaps from gazing upon these rays you fall into a deeper pit of darkness. There is no question in that, but what he is very much aware, that the disposition of the human spirit, the disposition of the soul, is necessary for this ascent into an encounter with God, into the divine darkness, on the 6 wings of the seraphim. If you haven't read the itinerarium, you probably should read it. If not for this class, probably for spiritual reading somewhere along the way. Because it's something that once you are used to, in a way, the scholastic mindset, as I hope by now we are, and probably you have been for a while, it's very important then to, you have the language that you need to understand the itinerarium. And it is a very, very valuable work. He says it was written in 1259, so many years after the death of Francis. And he tells about what he does when he goes there. And at any rate, he does go on to explain how he comes to this. And he sees that from the death, here it is, following the example of our most blessed Father Francis, I was seeking his peace for the panting spirit. I, a sinner and utterly unworthy, who after our blessed Father's death had become the 7th Minister General of the Friars, it happened about the time of the 33rd anniversary of the saint's death, which would be 1259. Under divine impulse, I withdrew to Mount Baverna, and while I was there reflecting on various ways by which the soul ascends into God, there came to mind, among other things, the miracle which had occurred to Blessed Francis in this very place, the vision of a winged seraph in the form of the crucified. While reflecting on this, I saw at once that this vision represented our Father's rapture and contemplation, and the road by which this rapture is reached. The 6 wings of the seraph can rightly be taken to symbolize the 6 levels of illumination, by which, as if by steps or stages, the soul can pass over to peace through ecstatic elevations of Christian wisdom. There is no other path but through the burning love of the crucified, a love which so transformed Paul into Christ that when he was carried up to the 3rd heaven, he could say, with Christ, I am nailed to the cross. I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me, and so forth. So this is the story, then, of the origin of the itinerarium. And I think that this is one of the important things in the hermeneutics of understanding St. Bonaventure. I think his introduction to the itinerarium tells us that it is not an exercise in pure reason, which is why he rejects the notion that there is a separation and a chasm between philosophy and theology. He sees them as one endeavor with different dimensions to it. Because if you break off into the realm of philosophically into the realm of pure reason, then you run the risk of never reaching the Christ. And that's what you see in the itinerarium. He employs reason. That's why it's interesting. He employs reason. And in that employment of reason, then he ascends the wings of the seraph. And as he ascends the wings of the seraph, reason begins to fade. And as reason begins to fade, then what he says is there is kind of a moral consciousness, a synderesis that takes place. And through that, then you move beyond reason, and what he says, into the divine darkness. And he uses the term divine darkness in a way that reflects it is no longer capable of being articulated in a rational way, because that we have gone beyond that. I don't know if you're in your history of philosophy, have you ever read the philosophy of Nicholas of Cusa, De Docta Ignorantia? He's a very important philosopher of the 15th century. He was the cardinal bishop of Brixen in southern Austria. He was very significant, and his treatises on faith and reason are very, very important in the development of the Catholic mind of the 15th century and beyond. He became, in German it's Nicholas von Kues, in English it's Nicholas of Cusa, and I don't know, however you run across him, it will be under probably one of those two names. But he is a significant character. And he models his philosophical reflections very much on Bonaventure's Itinerarium. That he's grappling with the problem, you cannot get to God by reason, but the approach to God is not unreasonable, which is what Vatican I defines. And so he tries to figure out how you come to a knowledge of God that does not confine God into the concepts into human rational concepts, which was a problem, which is why Cusa was kind of resurrected for a while in the 20th century as a prelude to a moving away from neo-scholasticism, because in neo-scholasticism, one of the criticisms of the 19th century was that a God that could be contained within the confines of human rational concepts is no God at all. There's an Irish poet, Paddy Kavanagh, says the God of all known is ridiculous. You cannot do that. And yet there was a tendency for enthusiastic, second-rate neo-scholastics to know everything there was to know. And there was nothing left that could not be known. And that kind of thing stimulated and was part of what, it's a wonderful story, but it's part of what created its own, in a Hegelian sort of way, created its own antithesis. And so out of this kind of deification of God through the tyranny of human reason, that what happened is that you began to develop philosophies that rejected that altogether, until you get to Nietzsche, who says, God is dead and Christianity has killed him. And it is the same philosophical argument. If he is able to be contained within the concepts of your mind, he cannot be a God. And so that kind of tension grew up, and it's why there was kind of a turning back. That's why Leo XIII tried to correct the neo-scholastic excesses by a return to Thomas himself, because it was all based on the Thomistic system, which had triumphed, which had won in the debate through the exercises of John the 22nd in the 14th century, when John the 22nd chose, in his battle with the Franciscans, chose to canonize Thomas Aquinas without any process. He just did it. And in so doing, then, he canonized his system. And then he turned the cooperative branch of the Franciscan order, who, despite, if any of you were at the retreat when Father John Stowe was there, despite Father John Stowe's defense of the conventuals, it was, in fact, the conventuals who the Pope turned loose on the spirituals, and the result of it was the repression of the whole spiritual movement within the Franciscan order. There's a book, The Pope's Cardinal, or something. It's a clear thing with the Franciscan cardinal is that is the inquisitor against the spiritual Franciscans and so forth. So if you're interested in that piece of history, there's an award-winning book by David from Virginia Polytechnical Institute. Okay. David Burr, called The Spiritual Franciscans. It won the National History Book Club Award about 10 years ago or so. And it really is an interesting story. But the result of it was that it was, and I'm saying that Cusa was the corrective, but he was a place to go for those who were trying to wrench themselves free from the neo-scholastic excesses of the 19th century. And so he was revived and kind of rediscovered. He was kind of, in my history of philosophy courses, and this is a few years ago, Cusa was, he was not a hero, but he was a player. And we had to read some of Cusa and stuff. His greatest work was De Dope et Ignorantia. And he felt that there was a form of ignorance that, in other words, an anti-rational component of the human person that had to be achieved before there could be an encounter or a really knowing of God. And that's a lot what Bonaventure says in the prologue, you know, that he's warning against a purely scholastic approach to the knowledge and the relationship with God, a purely academic approach, a purely rational approach. Although he makes it very clear that the ascent of the first few wings of the Sabbath are ascended by reason. And he uses Aristotelian terminology and so forth until you get to this symbiosis, this moral consciousness, which then opens you up again to the vulnerability to the unknown. And it is in that point when you become vulnerable to the unknown instead of claiming to be able to define it. Part of the reaction of that too is in the Devotio Moderna. How many of you have read The Imitation of Christ? You know, that's a very important piece that moves along in this direction. The great line of, you know, I would rather be able to experience compunction than define it, which always drove us when we got into the dictionary over and over again, because no one could remember what compunction was. But it is, which means probably we didn't have it. But
You experienced it, you couldn't define it.
I couldn't define it. So that, you know, that's the piece now that Bonaventure inserts into the medieval discussion, the medieval dialogue. This, it isn't a conflict between faith and reason for Bonaventure. There is no conflict, which is why he, as I said, why he rejects philosophy as a separate discipline from theology, that they are integrated, they are one. And I remember at the Josephina one time, someone coming in, and I said something, I don't know, I always say something I shouldn't, but I said something about, I don't know, I included a philosophical argument. I think it was, you know, in the Trinity or something. It was for a Catholic thought class or something. And I was corrected and told that you couldn't apply, you know, that it was, you couldn't mix theology and philosophy. So I never really believed that, and of course I still don't. But that's beside the point. It is for Bonaventure a single endeavor. Bonaventure has a very interesting book, too, a very interesting treatise, not a book, called The Reduction of the Arts to Theology. But in Aristotle, there is the list of what the arts are. And in those, Bonaventure says all of those ultimately collapse into a theological system, so that there is no category of knowledge which cannot be contained or drawn into the whole theological endeavor. According to, so you could not categorize or compartmentalize knowledge. Eventually, and again, you can understand that from Bonaventure's understanding of the role that light plays, the first form. There is nothing which is not grounded in the Christ. And since there is nothing which is not grounded in the Christ, that all things then must lead in some way, shape, or form to God, and therefore be part of the theological exercise, the theological endeavor. And we saw that in the use of the physics of light of Robert Grosseteste, and how Bonaventure and Grosseteste both took that into the scriptures, and Grosseteste came up with the concept of the creation of the universe as being energy and light. And so it was, and the energy and light, even if we say that today, for Grosseteste and for Bonaventure, the light was the Christ, it was the person, it was the Word. And so there was no separation then between the explorations of physics and the explorations of Scripture and theology. So this kind of integrative kind of movement was very, very significant and very, very important for them. That being the case, then, we have to then begin to look in some ways as in some ways, what role, first of all, what is sin? What role does sin play in this drama of exitus and reditus? How does sin function? How does it play out in this tremendous sweeping from the Christ to the Christ? How does this anakephaliasis in Christo alla Bonaventure, how does that take into account the problem of the nature of sin? And so we know, for instance, that Bonaventure's sin is a disorder, as with Augustine. And it is, therefore, sin is the disordering of the proper relationship in acknowledgement of the vestiges of the divine in the created order, the rejection of proper knowledge or misdirected desire. This, along with the original disorientation or original sin, disrupts the harmony of the created order and damages the relationship between creation and creator. Humanity loses its capacity to adequately be a voice of praise, love, and appreciation to the giver of the gift of created existence. In a sense, redemption is the restoration of the voice of the created order, in conformity with the gift given and discernible in the book of creation. In other words, the word restores the conversation of praise from the created order to the creator. And we looked at that last time and saw how that then kind of segues into the whole discussion of what liturgy is. But first of all, I think it would be important for us to look and to see, in fact, what Bonaventure says that sin really is and how it comes about. I think I mentioned before that there is a dated kind of Old Testament scholar, Gerhard von Rad, from the mid-20th century, who does kind of a really kind of fascinating, basically I would call it a psychological study of original sin, and does it in the way an exegete would do it. But in Bonaventure, we can see this. We can see this also. Because one of the big questions is, and this is true also in all of the theology and philosophy, what is the nature of evil? Is evil something, or is evil a deprivation of something? If it is something, then it cannot be totally evil. For everything that is has its source in the Creator. If evil exists as something, then evil has to have something good about it, or it could not exist because it could not have been created by God. If evil is a deprivation, then it is the absence of good, and it is a lack. My recollection and understanding is Thomas comes down on the side of it being a deprivation, a lack. And that's, I think, what he says that evil is. Bonaventure does not contradict that, but he has some interesting explanations of it. And he says, and this is out of the Breviloquium, having briefly clarified certain matters relating to the Trinity of God and the creation of the world, we shall now with equal brevity touch upon the corruption caused by sin. What we must hold is summarized thus. Sin is not some positive essence, but a defect, a corruptive tendency, that is a force which contaminates mode, species, and order in the created will. Hence the corruptive power of sin, while opposed to good as such, yet has no being except in a good, and no origin except from a good, which good is the will's capacity for free choice. And this capacity is not entirely evil, for it may tend toward good, nor entirely good, for it may fall into evil. This should be understood as follows. And then he goes on about the nature of the order of sin, of original sin and of actual sin, then for Bonaventure takes place in the will. And remember, when we talked about the will, how does the will function? It is part of the tripartite soul. It is a part of the soul. Memory, intellect, and desire. So there is where it resides. What do we call desire oftentimes in relationship to the tripartite soul? Concupiscence. Concupiscence exists as a part of the soul, as desire, which can be oriented toward good or sin. Concupiscence is not necessarily an orientation toward evil, but it is where desire influences the activity of the will. And in so doing, and he says, but man, made out of nothingness and imperfect as he was by nature, had the capacity of acting for ends other than God, of acting for himself instead of for God, and thus not properly by the power of God, nor according to God, nor for God as an end. And that precisely is sin, the vitiation of mode, species, and order. As sin is a defect, it has a cause which is not efficient, but deficient, being the defection of the created will. Sin can only be the corruption of a good, and only a corruptible being is subject to corruption. Therefore, sin can be found only in some corruptible good. So he agrees then with the general tendency. You cannot postulate evil as having essence, as being a being. It has to be a defect of something good. And he's going to explain that as he goes on to the temptation of Eve. And it was interesting to me that while I'm very taken with Von Rod's discussion, it's very similar to the discussion that's in the Breviloquium, that he explains the process of sin. And he says, if we are to understand how the corruptive power of sin entered the world, we must consider the fall of our first parents, the transmission of original sin, and the origin or root of actual sin. As to the fall of our first parents, there are 3 points to consider: the diabolical temptation, the act of sin itself, and the consequent penalty. Concerning the temptation, the following must be held. God established man in the bliss of paradise, having made 2 sexes, male and female. Then the devil, envious of man, and this is an interesting thing in the angelology of Bonaventure, that the battle between Michael and Lucifer took place over us. That what what Lucifer saw was that God intended creatures who were to be the totality of the created order and not just a part of the created order. In other words, the angels were pure spiritual beings. But man was to be a combination not only of the spiritual, but also of the material universe, and therefore, in a way, more complete than the angels. And Bonaventure says that the redeemed humanity is destined to replace the fallen angels in the hierarchies of heaven. Okay? So he has an exalted understanding of what humanity can become. In saying that, then, that he says that it is for this reason, then, that the devil wanted to tempt human beings and to break their relationship with God, and therefore to keep them from replacing himself in the celestial hierarchies. And so he says, concerning the temptation, the following must be held. God established man in the bliss of paradise and so forth. Then the devil, envious of man, assumed the form of a serpent and addressed the woman, first asking, did God say, you shall not eat of any of the fruit of the garden? And then we know that Eve says, no, that's not what he said. What does she do? She enters into a conversation with the devil. Now, that's not a fair contest. And it is like in the temptations of our own lives. When we enter into a conversation with serious temptation, we might as well write the end of the story. We either reject it, or in the dialogue, we are sucked into it. Okay? Now, feminists would not like what he says next, but it says it, so here it is. And Eve said, no, she said, Eve says, no, we can eat of the fruit of the tree, but not the fruit in the center of the garden. And then Satan says, well, why did he tell you not to? Well, he said we would die if we did that. And Satan said, you won't die. And do you know why he does that? Do you know why he said that? He said that because he's jealous of you. He doesn't in any way, want you to share what he has. But if you eat the fruit, then you will be like him, and you will know good and evil. So the temptation to replace God with the Son. Okay? By this temptation, he sought to bring about the fall of the weaker woman, so that through her he might then overthrow the stronger sex. This God permitted him to do. Now this is an interesting thing in this scriptural business of original sin. What in the Old Testament? What in the Old Testament is the reverse of the story of the fall? Absolute reverse. The Jewish legend of redemption. What is it?
Maccabee's mother.
No, it's more joyful.
Suffering servant?
No. Job. The devil is unleashed to tempt Job, and God gives him permission. Job suffers the temptations he goes through. He loses his children, his flocks, all this kind of stuff. He's got boils all over him. He's lost everything, blah, blah, blah. But he never gives in. He's tempted constantly to give in. His friends come. His wife even says, curse God and die. Charming lady, apparently. But he perseveres in his fidelity to God. And then what happens in the end? Everything works out great. He's happier than ever. He's got another wife. He's got more children. He's got more flocks. He's got all of it. And none of his children, none of his daughters, no one in Israel was more beautiful than his daughters, and so on and so forth. It comes out to a story that ends in perfection. It is the absolute antithesis of Genesis, of the story of the fall in Genesis. It is kind of a Jewish story of redemption through fidelity. Obviously, the authenticity of the book is challenged, the ending is challenged, all of this kind of stuff. I think that Mr. Mulatieri is teaching Job now, isn't he? Are any of you in that? Yeah, and it is the antithesis of the story of Genesis. It's the story of God allowing temptation, but of Job resisting through unbelievable hardships, only in the end then to be rewarded for his faithfulness. This is not what happens in Genesis. Okay? This should be understood as follows. The first principle, as he is utterly powerful in the act of creating, is also utterly just in the act of governing. Therefore, he so governs the things he has made so as to let them move by their own inner powers. Now, since man was made in order to win the prize of eternal peace by fighting to a final victory, God, while knowing that man would yield to temptation, could not but let him be tempted by whosoever had the wit, the might, and the will to tempt. Now Satan, wise and just at first, but rendered sly and envious after falling to his act of pride, had the will to tempt because he hated, and in his craftiness he knew how to tempt. He therefore challenged man with all the might God would let him use. And this, again, in Job. You know, God lets Satan go to do this. But by God's will, the tempter had to take the serpent's form, not only that his cunning might be seen, but also that by such a sign all Adam's sons might learn how shrewd a tempter Satan is. The temptation concerned a precept of discipline. It's interesting. Again, this was by God's permission. Whether the devil was finally to win or lose, all human beings were thus to learn the merit of obedience and the evil of rebellion. But it was by the devil's own cunning that he approached the woman first, for it is easier to overcome the weak. A clever enemy always attacks a stronghold at its weakest point. The devil was extremely clever also in the manner in which he tempted, for he went about it by probing, prodding, enticing, probing by his question, prodding by his assertion, enticing by his promise. I'll overlay that on any experience of sin. First, by asking about the purpose of command, he awakened doubt in the rational power. When doubt was felt, lest we die, he gave reassurance, inducing contempt in the irascible power. And finally, he uttered his promise, provoking the concupiscible power to desire. By this triple approach, he wrested consent from the free will, a faculty of both intellect and will, and embracing also the rational, irascible, and concupiscible powers indicated above. Those are the manifestations of the tripartite soul. Accordingly, the devil enticed the woman by proposing a triple object. Knowledge, appealing to the rational power, godlike eminence, appealing to the irascible, and the sweet fruit of the tree, appealing to the concupiscible. Thus he tempted everything that could be tempted in the woman, by every means that could lead her into acquiescence, that is, by the triple worldly lure, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. For all temptation stems from one of these three, the world, the flesh, or the devil. So, in his analysis then of sin, he certainly is moving away, very strongly moving away from the notion somehow or other that sin is itself an entity. It is in fact a misfunction. It is in fact a failure of a good. The garden was good. The relationship between Adam and Eve was good. The relationship between Adam and Eve and God was good. The fruit was beautiful to behold. And then he's going to go on and he's going to say, why did Adam become complicit? And that's really, he says, first of all, the woman is seduced. Why does Adam become complicit? And he says, both man and woman, the woman led astray beguiled the man. He turned to the external book and to perishable goods. In this excessive love for the woman's company and the solace of her presence, he shrank from reproving her, lest he endanger his own happiness. Because he did not rebuke what he should have rebuked, the woman's sin was imputed to him. When out of concern for his own delight, he failed to reject the woman's offering, he committed an act of selfish love that cast him out of the friendship of God and made him fall into greed and disobedience. That's kind of interesting too. Eve was enticed by the devil. She was outwitted by the devil. Then Adam never corrected that because he didn't want to get her upset and endanger his own happiness. And so fine, whatever you want. So he chose his own happiness and his own peace over what he owed to his Creator, to his God. The woman was deceived, the man was not. Yet in both man and woman there occurred a disruption of order in all their powers, from the highest to the lowest. First in their intellect, then in their senses, and finally in their actions. Both fell into disobedience and succumbed to greed, because both had risen in pride. In the woman, it was out of avidity and desire for what she had not. In man, out of excessive love and concern for what he had. The woman believed that if she ate, she would be exalted. Adam, relying on his own greatness and God's love, did not expect a heavy punishment. Never yet had he experienced the rigor of God's severity. By their inordinate attempt to rise above what they were, both fell wretchedly below what they were, from the state of innocence to that of guilt and misery. Okay, I think that's a fascinating understanding of the nature of sin. And if you read that over and you analyze in our own lives, our own experience and our own story of sin in our lives, which everybody has, how did it transpire? What was it that led us there? That, and Bonaventure says this later on, certainly in the area of lust, we know the power and the strength of desire. But that is not alone enough, because you must then have the cooperation of the will, and you must reject the rational analysis of what you're doing. So that once the discussion begins, you have already taken a step contrary to reason toward lust and desire, whatever it is, whether it's sex or whether it's a diamond ring in a jewelry store window, whatever it is, it enthralls you. And and I think he says something here too, that Adam presumed. Adam, relying on his own greatness and God's love, did not expect a heavy punishment. He thought, what's the big deal? So I ate an apple. You know? What's the big deal? God will understand. But the fact of the matter was, the whole thing was rooted in pride and disobedience and self-centeredness. So Bonaventure then introduces this notion of sin into the whole story of the redemption of humanity. And he does so in relationship to the powers of the soul. Then he goes on to say something very interesting, though. He says, since the will and since the soul is not generated by the parents, but is infused by God, that the transmission of the sin must take place in the flesh. In a more rigorous time, that was part of the cultural preference of virginity to marriage. Not that there are other arguments, obviously. And obviously it is rooted in a whole different anthropology than that. But it came, people blamed it on the Jansenists or the Calvinists or whoever it was. Whether they were responsible for it or not, who knows? It's not really clear. But the fact of the matter is that it was thought to be translated in the flesh, and since the transmission of life through the flesh is the conjugal act, the conjugal act entered into popular piety as kind of the root of the transmission of sin. Which is why the definitions concerning the permission for the conjugal act centered around the production of children. Because it had, even though in and of itself, it was a cooperator in sin through lust, it nevertheless had to have a good end because it was natural to the human person. And so it came to the point of where the generation, or what is it, the procreation and education of children became the primary end of marriage. In so doing, the church justified the conjugal act as a cooperator in good, even though, because it was the avenue of transmission of original sin, it could have been seen, and certainly the Cathars, the Alumbrados and so forth, and Bonaventure mentions the evil of the Manichaean perspective on all of this. But he does reason to the point where it cannot be transmitted through the soul because the soul is directly infused by God. And therefore it must be transmitted through the flesh. But he doesn't condemn all the fleshly transmission of life by original sin. He sees that as a consequence, not in essence inherent in the marital act. Now Bonaventure, of course, would be a creature of his age in many ways. And it was a time when certainly the life, the celibate life, the virginal life, was always seen as superior to the married life. You know, and I've often wondered, I think there's a lot of historical, and I think there's a lot of cultural pieces to that. You know, what was the average age? People could live to great old age, but they had to get past about 45 to do it. Okay? Husbands usually, and this is true too in most agricultural societies before high-tech farming, that large families were necessary, economically necessary for the family to thrive. So there were typically large families, but women frequently died in childbirth. And so a husband, if he had a family, had to remarry because the physical labor of managing a family could not be done and also do the work to bring in the income. That was true even into the 20th century in many ways. You know, I had a grandmother who was born in the 1860s and lived as though they never went away. And so I got to see up close and firsthand, you know, the intense labor that went into managing a house. The whole idea of hauling hot tubs of water to do washing, the whole idea of fixing stoves and furnaces, you know, all that kind of stuff. The spring cleanings, the hauling out of rugs, all that kind of business. It was hard physical labor. Of even cooking, there were no freezers. And refrigerators were, you know, in the early days, ice boxes. And then even when they were refrigerators, you didn't retain things very long in them. So shopping every day was part of it. Fixing everything from scratch was part of it. All those kinds of things. You couldn't do that in a single-parent home. It couldn't be done. Women were essential to the economic well-being of a family. And so, in the cities, oftentimes, if the woman died, the husband would put the children in an orphanage because there was no way he could take care of them. You know, if they worked in factories 12 hours a day, you couldn't look after your children. So they put them in orphanages. The Catholics put them in Catholic orphanages run by nuns and so forth. If you died at 45 and this was your life story, even the royalty, I think James of England, your children died off, your wives died off, you died off. There was not even aspirin, there was nothing. It was natural to see, in a way, the trials and the hardships of family. Bad that happened. And so the idea that marriage somehow, you know, if a nun or it seems somehow or other as there must be, you know, there's a punishment involved in all this. And I think that that kind of the negative view of the married life. But it doesn't come strictly out of theology. That will be transmitted in the flesh. And so what is the element in the flesh that would cause the transmission? It's possible to have sexual relationships between the husband and wife which are not lustful in the sense of lust is a sin. Of course it is. Being transmitted that way led then to a denigration of the flesh. Is kind of the maverick element of the human person, in which this original fault is. But if you think about it, if it's not transmitted in the soul but in the flesh, flesh transmits what it is. The pristine state. But it is through lust that original sin is transmitted. He was a very significant moral theologian of the 50s and 60s, a redemptorist, a German redemptorist. very kind of beautiful treatise, but basically when he's done, there's almost nothing anymore. Very actively into Bonaventure's understanding now of this reditus and that is sin kind of detours and blocks, advances. It's still advancing, but just not. And this is interesting. The punishment of a perpetual disorder must be perpetual. For a sin which a man commits and never repents remains forever in the soul and separates it from eternal. And since he cannot suffer a pain of infinite intensity, he must suffer one of infinite duration. Now that's perfectly reasonable. But it's interesting here how he moves into the whole concept of time as duration. What is time then, ultimately? If we look at time as duration, what is it ultimately? If that's all there is in time, is duration. It is a prison. It's something that traps us. In order for us to go into eternity, we have to escape time as duration. And that's why the whole discussion and the whole philosophy of time is a very, very important thing when we're talking about the nature of reality. It's something that kind of feeds into all this quantum theory and so forth that we mentioned in some way. Time then becomes vulnerable to multiple interpretations of its reality. Whether it is the accumulative notion of time that we find in the scriptures, whether it is the past, present, and future of the memory, whatever it has a variety of different realities to it. Time as duration becomes ultimately hell. In its final consequence. With the incarnation of Christ, the flow of emanated created reality turns back to its source. This turn in history, in time, places Christ as the center of the historical drama of creation, and all reality comes to the fullness of time in the birth of Jesus, when it turns and begins the long journey back to its origin, back to the center from which it has come. This is the Christocentric understanding of history in Bonaventure. In Ratzinger's book, The Theology of History in Bonaventure, I think we've talked about the history of that history, that Ratzinger maintains that Bonaventure's understanding of this exitus and reditus is influenced by Joachim, and is not really a philosophical reflection, but historical and eschatological. In a way, this is difficult to accept completely because of the speculative nature of Bonaventure's reflections on the Trinity and the Incarnation in the sentences. It is nevertheless a very valid insight into Bonaventure's understanding of the ultimate goal of creation, the drama of journey through time that emanated all reality, the whole created order. This brings in another point that Bonaventure incorporates. Because all knowledge oriented toward the good. And God is goodness. So all knowledge is oriented toward the good. That being the case, there is no field of knowledge that is not crucial to the theological endeavor. Bonaventure, and Ratzinger points this out very clearly, Bonaventure incorporates history into his theological system, his theological endeavors. That's what this whole thing is all about. The exitus, the reditus, the Christocentrism, it's all about history. It's all about the passage of time and the story of humanity as it falls on this movement out of Christ and back into Christ, through the emanation of the human person and of all the created order. So when Bonaventure, analysis of Bonaventure, the argument about, and a lot of the Franciscans take umbrage at Ratzinger's thesis. He's a theologian. It's not history, it's theology. But there again, that takes us back to the problematic that we ran into that Deserto analyzes, identifies. That before the 16th century, the fields of knowledge, of theological learning, were separated adjectivally. After the 16th century, they were separated substantially. So that from the 16th century on, disciplines, academic disciplines, cannot communicate with each other without raising objections. You can't ask that question in philosophy because that's a theological question. You can't ask that question in theology because that's a philosophical question. You can't ask that question in physics because it's not a theological issue. You can't use anthropology, you can't use biology, you can't use literature, you can't use any of that because those are separate disciplines. And in the compartmentalization of the fields of learning, that there is a resistance to the intermingling of disciplines. This is the critique and the criticism. I think I mentioned it here somewhere. There's a theologian, a female theologian at Leeds, maybe in England, Karen Kilby. She writes a scathing critique of von Balthasar because, and her critique is this, that first of all, he dares to speak from a divine perspective. In other words, he accepts revelation. The other thing is that he uses other disciplines to argue theological points, such as literature and art and music and so forth. She is the quintessential contemporary manifestation of the problem that Deserto talks about that began in the 16th century, that you cannot cross categories in learning. It has to be a pure discipline without infringement from the outside. What Ratzinger says is that this is not the way Bonaventure functions. He does not function that way. He is as much a historian of humanity as he is a theologian. Many of the Franciscans object to this, and many of them object to it for one interesting reason, I think, and this is not a heavy criticism or anything, but they have applied to the study of theological texts of Bonaventure and Scotus and so forth, the historical critical method, which means that all the meaning of the text exists within the text itself, and that it is illegitimate to interpret using tools from outside the text as authentic interpretations of what the text says. And so, while it produces much fruit, just like it did in the scripture, it somehow or other seems contrary to the spirit of Bonaventure, which is why they resist Ratzinger's interpretation, which might be excessive actually. But whatever it is in fact saying that there is an admixture within the theological perspective of at least of history as a discipline. And history, if theology is the study of God, and God is only known in relationship to creation, and if you cannot include the created order in the study of God, then it seems to me that you can't study God except as an abstraction, as an exercise of the mind that enjoys the same realm of abstraction in some ways as higher math or something like that would be as well. It's interesting. And so this is part of where the controversy over Ratzinger's book comes in. If any of you read Ratzinger's book, Theology and History of Bonaventure, Rupert of Deutz is in there significantly, so it might be helpful. So with this in mind, then we can understand sin. Now, and this feeds back into Skonenberg's, what Skonenberg says. We can understand sin as an historical phenomenon that moves out of the flow toward the end, the center of God, and leaves one imprisoned in time as a continuing duration rather than into the eternal moment of God. When Francis says, "Woe to the one who dies in mortal sin," he is lamenting the person trapped in an infinite duration of time that leads nowhere and is filled with the continuing experience of the inadequacy of an existence imprisoned by sin. Have any of you ever read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really fascinating. They're there because they choose it. They're just not going to, they love this dirty little English industrial town. And they don't want anything that's beautiful or nice or good. They're happy where they are, complaining, moaning about everything around them. Trapped in the eternal duration of time, I agree, that leads nowhere and is filled with a continuing experience of the inadequacy of existence imprisoned by sin. So, sin, therefore, is a reality in the theology of St. Bonaventure, and it is that realistic corrective which enters into the image of the emanation and the return. The image, if you remember from Ecclesiastes, of the river flowing out of the temple, fructifying everything it touches, and then flowing back into the temple again. Bonaventure's own scriptural image of emanation. In doing that, then, he introduces what Chardin did not introduce, which is the reality of sin. And in so doing, by maintaining that there can be an infinite duration of time as a prison, that he does also avoid the over-optimism of Pete Skonenberg in his God's world in the making, I think that's it. But where he sees these as interruptions. Bonaventure says you can opt out of the cycle. You can get out of the cycle through unrepentant sin. And this is why it becomes so important to become agents of reconciliation and agents of forgiveness in the world, because it liberates people from their own prison, their historical prison in time. And it was part of the reason, too, for the tremendous energy that went into the missions, especially when the age of discovery came. There is a dissertation, I think, from Catholic U, I'm not sure, on an analysis of the Franciscan missions to Latin America during the Age of Exploration. And you know that in the English interpretation of the colonization of South America, you know that the picture of was it Atahualpa, the famous picture of Atahualpa? Was he the Inca? He was an Inca, I think. And there was a famous picture of him burning at the stake with a Franciscan friar holding a crucifix up to him. And the story was that they said that if he would accept Christianity, he would live. And so he did. And they baptized him and then they killed him. So they were blind to it. But in his mind, he must have considered it a trick. But anyways, hopefully the grace of baptism prevented that. But at any rate, what the point is that the dissertation says that part of the zeal of the Franciscan missionaries in Latin America, part of the urgency to baptize everybody, and not just the Franciscans, but read the beautiful story of Peter Claver in Colombia, and even Francis Xavier in the Far East, that they were infused with a residue of Joachimism. The end is near. There's not time. There's not time to dilly-dally. You baptize them now because the end is almost here. And so that idea of the eschatological moment hovering on the horizon drove them with urgency to baptizing in the missions. Francis Xavier baptized 300,000 in Ceylon. And when questioned about, well, what were they Christian? What did they know? He said they can say the Our Father. If you can say the Our Father and you're baptized, you're saved. Especially if the end is hanging over your head. And that's why he went to Japan, and that's why he was on his way to China, and that's why the missionaries flooded South America and Central America. Was in an attempt to bring people into the kingdom of God, and motivated by the great commandment, if you love your neighbor, you want them to go to heaven. That, if you love your neighbor, you want them to go to heaven. How are they going to get there? They have to be baptized. And that was one of the great motivations of the huge waves of foreign missions. It was one of the reasons why the Protestants didn't have any missions at all until the 19th century. Because believing in predestination, the differences are made. You're not going to convert anybody. They're already damned. So what's the rush? You know? If I'm of the elect, there's nothing I can do about anybody else, just like there's nothing I can do about me. So, all right.
but
The big one.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Could you do that? Yeah. Just for the so you know, I can't talk to Christian said it's okay.
Oh, I see.
He just wants to know how many. So you tell us and then buy that amount of stuff.
Oh, yeah. I can do that.
Okay.
When does he need back?
Whenever before we leave.
About a week, yeah. Just before Tuesday.
Yeah. So sometimes send out. Sometimes we leave today. Sometimes Tuesday.
Do it now.
Thank you.
Franciscan archives out of Massachusetts. I didn't know that.
yeah, the bookstore needs to buy some of those.
Pardon?
The bookstore needs to buy some of those.
Buy 5 of them.
Right.
For
Good
$300.
deal. They'll mark them up.
Sell them for 100 a piece. Sell them for 70 and still be cheaper. So that just made 50 bucks. Anybody actually buys them? If not, on the whole.
Right. Once you're late, we'll buy one.
I mean, it also depends on whether or not you can, the book's going to buy them at cost or if you have to do your own price. And there's no point.
I mean, it wouldn't they be?
It's only after a
You
month.
would think so? With the schlubs around this place?
Okay. So if we're talking then about humanity and its relationship to the emanated reality of Christ, and we see that Francis himself can say, woe to the one who dies in mortal sin, then we have to go backwards a little bit and back into analysis of who the human person is. We've already looked at the tripartite soul, but now let's look at it a little bit more deeply and then see exactly how this idea then, if Jesus is our Savior and our Redeemer because he assumes our nature, then we have to find out what this nature is that he assumes. And then we'll go and we'll look and see what that means for him. But first of all, let's see who we are first, if he assumes our nature. Then what does that mean for him in his knowledge, his wisdom, his understanding, and all of this kind of thing? We'll look at that. As I say, is redeemed. Bonaventure roots his response in the biblical story of creation and responds that the human race was created in the image and the likeness of God. We've already looked at that, haven't we? Into the creation story. Yeah. Does anyone remember? Or is it completely alien and foreign? You've never heard of All right, here we go. So, since God is triune, the human person is also composed of a Trinitarian element. If we're created in the image and the likeness of the divine, and the divine is triune, then there has to be a triune element of the human person, or they cannot be in the image of the divine. Nor would they be able to relationally participate in the divine being unless they could correspond to that which they were participating in. In other words, they had to be in that image. Following Augustine, Bonaventure explores the tripartite soul. And we saw this before. He says the soul is divided into 3 parts: memory, intellect, and will. These divisions have very particular meanings. The memory contains 5 elements. I think we looked at those, didn't we?
Yeah.
The consciousness of the past, the awareness of the present, some knowledge of the future, holds the most basic principles of intellectual thought, and the axioms of the sciences. All right? Now, how does this correspond to Aristotle? Would Aristotle be affirming this understanding of the human soul? do you know about Aristotle's epistemology?
Based on senses.
Do you know the process? How do you come to know? Eric?
A repeated number of instances of particular phenomenon, and you sort of abstract the essence that underlies all of them.
It's the agent intellect that abstracts, and the abstractions habitually reside in the possible intellect.
Yeah. The agent intellect abstracts.
Intelligible species from particulars.
Yes, and then they are stored in the passive intellect, and the passive intellect is then acted upon by reason or judgment. And it's at that the abstraction of the essence is infallible. Where the human error can come in is when reason is applied to the passive and to the phantasms. That's the word. To the phantasms impressed upon the passive intellect. And then in that rational judgment is where the human is capable of error. So that knowledge in its first movement is infallible. But it comes from the perception of entities outside of itself. So it seems, and I don't know this, but it seems probably that Thomas would not, maybe he would be, and I don't know how he does it, would not actually be absolutely comfortable with this Augustinian notion of the tripartite soul, which is derived from Plotinus. That in moving away from Plotinus and Augustine in this particular area, Thomas quotes Augustine more than any other source. And there are times when Augustine and Thomas agree, and Bonaventure disagrees with them. So while you can call Bonaventure Augustinian, which essentially he is in many ways, because he is in that Neoplatonic tradition, from Plotinus to Augustine and then to Pseudo-Dionysius and the Victorines and so forth, throughout the whole process of the development of Neoplatonism. But it doesn't seem to me that Thomas would be comfortable with Augustine's tripartite soul or Plotinus' tripartite soul. But maybe he would be, I don't know that, okay? Memory then containing the consciousness of the past. Now, when we say, or maybe we will bring it in now, when we say that Jesus assumes human nature, his human nature contains a tripartite soul. That's what animates his human nature. If the tripartite soul, in its memory, contains a consciousness of the past, think about what that might mean. If we ourselves have a consciousness of the past, what is the past? What would that mean for us? Somehow or other, that has to mean something participatory in human experience, in the human species, and in its origin. So it's in the consciousness of the past that there is an elemental because the only past we have is the activity of God upon our soul. So it's possible, without going into the whole Jungian thing, which I really think is very interesting. I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in it, but it's really kind of interesting to read and to sing. Because what he does is he works with these concepts in strange and different sorts of ways. And there is something, and if we have time we'll look at it, it really, in one way, is the only tool we have to interpret one of the visions of St. Clare, which is very, very significant in her story. But the famous vision of St. Clare taps into this. We enter into the realm of the very speculative and very unknown. When you get into what are you born with a consciousness of the past? What is that? It can mean a number of different things. It can feed into the whole psychological reality of, in utero memories and the impact of the external life while the mother is carrying the child. If the mother is stressed, if the mother is upset, if the mother is ill, if the mother listens to different kinds of music, if the mother is happy, all those kinds of things, theoretically have an impact on the formation of the consciousness of the child. Is this what it can mean? And this is certainly not something that was in the medieval mind, but certainly in the modern world, yeah, it could mean that. Is there a memory somehow of source? Is there some kind of an unconscious grasp of source, which is more Bonaventure would say, the unconscious grasp of a divine origin, which is why he says everybody has an innate relationship with God. But it might well exist in the unconscious rather than in the consciousness. And if that's true, and if you're a minister of the gospel, then how do you touch into the unconscious of a person to stimulate a memory which would make them vulnerable to faith? It's kind of an interesting question. Besides in a formal Catholic psychotherapeutic situation, is there any way to sense that? An awareness of the present, well, that's, for some of us that's a problem, but not for everybody, okay? And some knowledge of the future. This is where that whole notion of time comes in. Because you can't have knowledge of the future in duration of time. You can't because it hasn't happened yet. And therefore it's not real. So what is this saying in the tripartite soul of the three components of the first three characteristics of memory? It means that it has to have some kind of relationship to something that is not time as duration. It has to have some kind of relationship in some way, shape, or form with eternity. It has to have something like that. Which is why in ancient Jewish society, there was not a big problem with accessing the past through word and ritual, because it already resided somehow in the consciousness of the people. And the reason to do so was some kind of sense of deliverance in the future, which is what the whole Messianic hope was all about. So there is, at least in early Jewish society, and maybe probably also not only in ancient Jewish society, many primitive societies experience this kind of a thing. If, for instance, it's in the some primitive societies carry it in music, in epics. Part of an epic is to resurrect the sense of events. Maybe not the same kind of experience that you get in the Old Testament, but a sense of the event. To read a great epic in some way makes real for you things that have already transpired. And that might be subjected in your mind through the gift of memory, but unlike the reality of it in the Jewish sense of memory or the Christian sense of memory in the liturgy, but certainly people have an inner sense, kind of, for good and for ill. For instance, the blood feuds and the grudges and so forth that go on, like the war in the Balkans in the 90s. They were settling scores from the 16th century. I mean, sometimes the memory, and it was as real for the people of the 1990s as it was for the people of the What is that? Why does that happen? Which probably one of the stupidest things that was ever said. One of the Richard Holbrooke, I think he was a diplomat in the Clinton administration, said something about the Balkans. Well, we don't really, care about their history. We'll just solve the problem, which probably was not the brightest statement ever. But because it isn't going to be solved that way. And while this is certainly true in Eastern Europe, it's true in many cultures. In many cultures, there's a sense of something beyond the self that exists. In old Celtic culture, there was a figure called the Brehon. You familiar with that at all? The Brehon was he was called the poet. But basically, he was the poet, the lawyer, the historian. He was charged in a claim to be the living memory of everything that they had experienced. And so he would turn much of it, which is why there was so much ancient Celtic poetry and songs. How do you remember things best? If you can sing the words, or if there's a rhythm to the words that you can repeat, and you can keep repeating. And as you do that, then part of the thing, who else did that? The rabbis did that. They had to memorize the Torah. They had to know the Torah by heart. And so in the reciting the Torah, they resurrected the history of their people, and then they could argue about how to interpret it in the present. All with an eye toward what comes next, and for many of them, a messianic age. For instance, like with the Essenes at Qumran and so forth. So not only has this been in modern psychology and modern psychiatry a useful tool, the whole idea of depth psychology, going into the memory of the person. And there was a great uproar in the mid-20th century about, through the use of hypnotism, people would be taken back into the womb, and then all of a sudden they would have memories from before they were conceived. Other people would emerge out of their memories. I mean, it was a very spooky kind of, some of it was a hoax, obviously. Some of it was just confusing. But there was a thing in the 50s called the Search for Bridie Murphy. Some woman was taken through hypnosis back into her prenatal days. And then all of a sudden she was another person telling the story of somebody else who could very easily have been an ancestor of some kind. So it brought up the whole question of how is there something like genetic memory? If our genes are triggered in such a way, is it possible for them to remember their present configuration? Now, that's pretty extravagant thinking, but it was a popular psychological game, I think, that people, then everybody wanted to get hypnotized to find out who they were before they were born. So, but that didn't work very well. So that was, but it was an interesting phenomenon while it was going on. It was. But it means, it's just like, a movie that tries to incorporate a flexible notion of time and space and light and so forth, even in a clumsy sort of way. This was probably a primitive attempt to deal with this whole Jungian, Freudian world of the unconscious, what roams and prowls in the depths of the human person. For Freud, of course, everything was dark in the unconscious. That wasn't necessarily true for Jung or for some of the others. But there is an acknowledgement that there is kind of an unconscious or a subconscious in most human persons. So that this idea then of memory, well, if we take all these things then, and then what we'll do is we'll apply these to the humanity of Jesus when we get there. And then it holds the most basic principles of intellectual thought. That means, in a sense, the principles of reason. So reason is an innate quality of the human person, according to this understanding. And the axioms of the sciences. That science, therefore, is not foreign to the comprehension of the human person. And that actually, when you hear something or learn something that actualizes an innate quality within yourself, there's a resonance that takes place, and you sense the truth of the axiom. You have no idea why you sense the truth of the axiom, except that it is contained in your soul, in the memory. And so what happens then in here is that what we're dealing with now is a very mysterious quality of the human person. The quality of the human person that somehow or other is in touch with origin and destiny, is how St. Bernard puts it. That you are in touch with where you've come from and you are in touch with where you're going, which means for us, through revelation, that Christianity is consistent with human nature. That that's its genius, is that it is inherent, innate in human nature. If we come forth from the Creator God, then there is some kind of unconscious sense of that connectivity. If our destiny is the return to God, there is an inherent sense in the human person of a kind of destiny. And so, if in fact the challenge of teaching Christianity demands that we understand human nature to do so, when we espouse phenomena contrary to the nature of the human person, there is no way, shape, or form that we can communicate the faith. Because it's contrary to instinct, and it's contrary to intuition. The faith must conform with the truth of the deeper levels of humanity, or it cannot be accepted. This is one of the reasons why so much of what we have held has been so... Does it ever kind of shock you about how successful Christianity was in spreading all over the globe, in every culture, in every way? Why? Authentic. This is the challenge, and this is why when Bonaventure says that theology is the reading of the book of creation, this is why we have to be so careful in our theological investigations and reflections that what we are espousing and saying is consistent with human nature. And this is part of the split and the division in the church today. Does human nature develop and change to conform to culture? Or is the role of the church to be specifically rooted in human nature that resists the artificiality of any contemporary culture? How do you do that? And it's not just a modern problem. It's a problem that we have always had. It's like our teaching on marriage and sex. When sex is the instrument of death, as it can become in some of the diseases and so forth today, then it ceases to be perceived necessarily as a good. And yet the whole question of human generation was surrounded in death for centuries. And that kind of a negative attitude towards sex does not have to be a Jansenist phenomenon. It can be a common human experience. You know? It is that which brings joy, love, creates families, but kills. You know? That whole good is wrapped in death. In that sense, it's true today, except we are the agents of the death. And it's not necessarily something that flows out of the nature of the human person. It becomes artificial when we become the killers rather than the medical fates of an age. So what happens then is that if this is true, if Augustine is right, if Bonaventure is correct, then what happens is that Catholic theology must resonate with human nature to be effective. If we want to ask, why is there a crisis today? Maybe it's because we have become sufficiently out of touch with human nature that we are unable to communicate. Maybe this is part of the power and the strength of John Paul's theology of the body, and maybe it's some of the power and the strength of some von Balthasar's acceptance as incorporative of the whole human experience rather than just of the mind. Maybe it's all these things. Who are we, how do we know these things? But these qualities of the memory are not held in consciousness, but in a priori principles used to shape conscious knowledge. Make sense? In encompassing past, present, and future, memory bears an analogy with God's eternity. So the memory of the tripartite soul is analogous to eternity, for it contains past, present, and future. Memory is then one of the most primal levels of pre-conscious contact with the divine ideas. Using the Augustinian understanding of the soul, Bonaventure comes to some knowledge of the pre-conscious or unconscious state that figures so significantly in modern psychology, especially in both Freud and Jung. So what we have, and I use Freud and Jung because they're kind of core principles, they're kind of foundations from which most of the rest of this stuff have flowed out into various and sundry directions. Whole questions, even like in the whole, like this business that's going on with Bill Cosby now, that 30 years ago, did he rape all these people, and what about the role that memory plays in the pedophilia litigation and all that kind of stuff? There's, is memory rooted in the existential realities, or does memory have a capacity for imagination? There's a book by Elizabeth Loftus. I remember her name was Anthony. She's a professor at the University of Washington, I think, who has written a psychology professor, who has written a book saying there is no such thing as repressed memory. And she's not very popular with lawyers. And so there is then all sorts of issues that arise out of this. It's something that I think that we should read about, we should reflect upon. Is there an innate relationship between revelation and human nature? Does that exist? According to this, it would exist. If it is true, then what does that mean for us who are teachers or preachers or disciples in any way in the modern world. Is there any way that we correspond to human nature in the things that we think and say, all those kind of our preaching, our teaching, all of that? Is that something that we search for? Or is all knowledge of revelation come into the human person from the outside? If it does, then things like technique and all that kind of stuff is important. All the use of all sorts of media and all that's important. If it's a question, crassly put, of marketing, you know? If all of it comes from the outside, then that's one thing. But if in fact it is an innate quality of every human person, history would seem to favor the second way. Because, you know, it's interesting in the whole liturgical discussion about how irrelevant, for instance, the Tridentine Mass was, blah, 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 all of that kind of thing. And certainly would be a hard thing if it had never changed at all and all this. But, you know, for 500-600 years, that's the Mass the missionaries said in Africa and Asia, all over the world. Was there something in the very fact of the Mass that touched the memory of the human soul? Because there is no absolute reason why that should have not been a problem. In Oceania, in Africa, in Asia, and so forth. But it wasn't an obstacle. At least it didn't stop the progress and the flow of faith. So, what does that mean? I don't know what it means. But it certainly means there's something going on in the whole idea of evangelization that we ourselves are not conscious of. We don't really understand or know what that means. The soul's second faculty is the intellect. And in the itinerarium it says the task of the intellect is to understand the terms, propositions, and inferences by which human knowers structure their knowledge and give it verbal expression and develop it by logical reasoning. Now here, there would seem to be some relationship with Aristotle and with Thomas, because there is within the human person a capacity for logical reasoning, which is called judgment. When it acts upon the phantasms of the past and intellect, it is called judgment. But it is, what Bonaventure says, it gives verbal expression and structures knowledge and develops through reason. So the intellect, therefore, structures, gives expression, and is a component of reason. The intellect, therefore, makes judgments about the being of things and ultimately comes to a concept of absolute being. This is so, and here he goes to his position, this is so because absolute being lies at the ground of all reality and can be pursued logically and even syllogistically. The intellect is, through interaction with memory, in contact with the divine principle, which is light, and therefore is illumined by the light of being to know things which, with certitude, which the intellect itself could not know with certitude. And the result of this logical process, however, leads only to a conceptual grasp of absolute being. So, through the intellect, you can come to a knowledge of God, but it is only a conceptual knowledge. It is not really, it is not a full knowledge. It exists only in the realm of reason, in the realm of ideas. But what Bonaventure is therefore saying is that by reason, we come to a conclusion ultimately, of the existence of an absolute being in a conceptual sort of way. What he's going to do in the itinerarium is going to talk about how we experience that. But here he's saying this is part of the rational process of the ascent, that you develop a conceptual grasp of absolute being. The will, the faculty of concupiscence, deliberates and judges the conceptual grasp arrived at by the intellect, and then desires the good. So the will is what grasps what the intellect articulates, expresses, and then perceiving that absolute being is a good, it desires that good. These judgments then engage in a reality that transcends the soul, and hence, like the intellect, it possesses a close relationship between the human soul and the reality of God as supreme truth and goodness. Once again, very clearly then, that this means, if this interpretation of the human person is correct, that there is an innate relationship all Christian theology must be in sync with be able to grasp and to articulate the powers of memory, intellect, and will. So it seems that the intellect raised the innate preconscious knowledge of the memory to consciousness. So it is the intellect which gives consciousness to the unconscious, or the preconscious. And the will, desiring the truth and the good of the first principle, establishes the conscious relationship between the human and the divine. The preconscious memory of the divine is expressed in the intellect and then desired by the will. You can see how sin screws this up. If these faculties are impaired, then they don't function properly. And if they don't function properly, they can't get where they're going. Zachary Hayes says, we find ourselves situated in a world of material beings. Our task is to discover the truth and the goodness of reality, first in and through the interior world of human consciousness, and in the transformation of the soul and its powers through grace. The interior world of human consciousness is not, however, simply a mental world or world of fantasy. As a real existence outside of our minds, and it is the subject of experience and scientific knowledge. It is sensed and can be known also through logical and syllogistic reasoning. So, there is probably an enormous theological question in assessing the effectiveness of a theological system. Not does it please human consciousness, but does it conform to human nature? Because that which is brought to consciousness through sin can be distorted. Because it is the will that is impaired. If that's the case, then a prelude to the proclamation of the faith is the forgiveness of sin. As the Father has sent me, I send you. Whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven them. What did the Father send him for? To prepare the world for the Word. What has to happen before the world is prepared for the Word is the forgiveness of sin. That's the mission of the church. And whether that's done in the sacramental sense, or whether there's other ways to find forgiveness. But you find that without forgiveness in the world, there is untold misery and suffering. This is part of the problem, part of the sticky problem, for instance, of the whole sex abuse business. Until the person is able to forgive, they are trapped forever as victims, and they will never be free. But what does it mean to forgive? Does that mean let somebody off the hook for doing something bad? No. But it means to see in them the same thing that is in us, the image and the likeness of the divine. And therefore, forgiveness means that you see in them a suffocating divine presence, which they must be liberated from. But in seeing that, we are liberated from our victimhood. And as soon as we are liberated from, that's part of the insidious thing of SNAP or something like that. Because, and it's the same thing in some of the civil rights business. The lack of forgiveness is a way to make big money, while it holds the people who are the victims trapped in their victimhood. And in so doing, it is incredibly inhumane. So it's a problem. And it's a problem that has to be addressed, and has to be addressed. We have to address it as disciples of the Lord. Therefore, knowing and being are not two separate realities, but differing aspects of all created reality, and especially proper to human beings in whom spirit and matter are reconciled. This is why biblical revelation enables humanity to read the great book of cosmic revelation that has been darkened by sin. The Gospels demonstrate this dramatically in the recording of the miracles of Jesus. We talked about that before. The created order, that which we call nature, is both light and energy. Genesis confirms that it is good and useful for humanity. At the same time, no one can deny that there is a great disorder in the created nature that surrounds us. So we are aware of natural disasters and so forth. And then we talked about what the miracle means. The miracles of the gospel can be seen in this Bonaventurian understanding of creation as moments of revelation. Jesus does not interfere with the created world. Humanity has done this through sin. Jesus reveals the gift as it was given before it was distorted by sin. He reveals the true nature of creation. He does not interfere with it or change something that was already given. What the crowd sees is what lies in wait for those who turn away from sin and turn toward faith in the Son of God. Only when freed from sin can humanity read the book of creation, and this they can glimpse in the biblical miracles of Jesus. So, there is now this unbreakable bond between God and humanity that is obfuscated through this whole business of sin that we saw in Bonaventure's understanding of sin. And it's really, and this is where it's really interesting too, sin can never be absolutely evil, no matter how awful it is. Because if it were, it wouldn't exist. So somewhere, even in the most heinous of crimes, there has to be a redeemable element. And that redeemable element has to be somehow or other making contact with something very, very deep within the human person. We see, for instance, this whole notion of victimhood. We see the hatred that it engenders. I mean, this is the essence of the Near Eastern problem, which is going to get worse and worse because we're not trying to solve it. I mean, this sounds simplistic, but this is why Christianity must exist in the Middle East. Because without it, there is no coming to terms. It's not faring very well. But it must somehow have an influence in the Middle East. Because if, in fact, Christianity is that which is consistent, that divine reality which is consistent with human nature, if it is not there, then evil takes over, and since evil cannot exist on its own, it is a formula for nihilism. Absolute nihilism. And it will self-destruct, because it cannot exist without some good within it. And certainly this crucifixions and beheadings and all that kind of lunacy that's going on over there is something that cannot be defeated, but it must be converted somehow. That's the task of the church. And I don't know how effective we are, but it's our challenge. If what we believe is true, then every living human person has the capacity to believe it at some level of consciousness or pre-consciousness. If it's true, isn't it true?
I got into an argument with somebody about this point, about there's an intrinsic capacity to relate to God versus is it completely extrinsic? And then if you say it is intrinsic to nature, then somehow that would limit God's freedom in offering. Salvation would no longer be a free gift in some sense. God would be compelled to save humanity. Otherwise, the internal nature which He created would be frustrated.
Exactly, that's how. The frustration of the inner nature of the human person. But it is not God that does that to them. It's what they choose for themselves. Exactly as the apple in the garden. So it is the frustration of the end of creation in one way, but in another way, it is the option and the freedom of the person. They will always exist. And that comes into the huge question, about is there then even in hell a possibility of ultimate redemption? Because if they exist, doesn't that interior relationship with God continue even in infinite durations of time that holds them prisoners because of their sin? So, you're right to a point, but I think it's a bigger picture. I think you have to expand that out. The other thing is to deny this intrinsic presence of the divine within the human person. And then, like I said, then we're challenged in technique, style, media, all that kind of stuff, because we have to pump it in from the outside. And basically, I would think that's more difficult. That's why you find even in places, that one of the things was like in the First World War, that famous battlefield in the First World War, where both the Germans and the Americans called a truce on Christmas Day, celebrating Christmas together. And they went back and started killing each other again. But to me, that would seem, those human moments within cultures of hatred and violence would seem to me to affirm something of the Augustinian vision of the human soul. But, it's not defined, so you can believe it, anybody can believe what they want of God. But I would think it is a hopeful and a compelling vision in so many ways. You know, they make movies out of the human moments of war and the human moments.
This is a movie about that battle that Christmas round.
Was it? Yeah. And I don't know. Humanity does have those capacities. But, I mean, I think Augustine and Bonaventure are somewhat compelling in all of this. But like I said, it's not defined, so this is a system that we can look at and see. And then I said about in the, I already read to you the business from the itinerarium. Repentance from sin is the prerequisite for the ability to understand the nature of the created order. It's, as Bonaventure says, its origin, magnitude, multitude, beauty, fullness, activity, and order and holiness. This is not a moral mandate, but a fundamental insight. Jesus, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, the source of divine exemplars, and the one through whom all created reality is emanated, is therefore both the temporal and eternal exemplar. We can say that his historical life in exegesis is the exegesis in time of the eternal mystery in which all created reality is grounded. He is therefore not a moral example, but the principle of all moral existence. For Bonaventure, Jesus' humanity is a passageway into all reality, created and uncreated. So unless we turn away from sin, the passageway is closed for us because sin cannot enter into the divine exemplar, the ground of all created being. How could sin be united with the one who was perfect, who was the center of the triune God? What is the way that we can enter the passageway? And here Bonaventure says, through poverty and the cross. These gifts that Francis gave to the world show us how we are to follow in his footsteps and enter into the mystery of Christ as he did. We cannot accept poverty or the cross of Christ without ourselves desiring to be forgiven and to be free of our sins. Okay. So, when we then talk about who is Christ as a human person, this is the substructure of what's essential to that. This is the substructure of how we go through and try to understand who is Jesus of Nazareth as a human being, human nature. Who is he? And these things then Bonaventure then applies, so we can see how that works. Okay? All right. Any questions?